Hi, and welcome to this new lecture in computer security. And in today's lecture, we will talk about a new class of protocols, protocols that provide for us specific property. This time, the property is forward secrecy. So we call this class of protocols the forward secrecy protocols. So we will look first of all at what we mean by forward secrecy, and then we will take some examples of protocols that give us forward secrecy in two ways. So first of all, we will look at some protocols that adopt Diffie-Hellman and some that adopt public key cryptography as solutions for providing this sort of forward secrecy property. So first of all, let's have a look at the definition of the forward secrecy property. Forward secrecy, or sometimes it goes under the name of perfect forward secrecy or PFS, is essentially a variation of the secrecy property, where the idea here is that the secrecy of previous session keys that you established in the past must not depend on the secrecy of your long-term keys or long-term passwords. Okay, so say you share some long-term password with a server, and if that password was compromised, so the server leaked that password to the public domain, the question is, will that compromise your historical interactions with this server? So if the historical interactions, any transactions you performed with the server, any communications you performed using certain session keys, if those are compromised, then the leak of the private key, in this case, must not result in the compromise of the security or those current communications using the session keys established prior to the server compromise. So that will mean essentially that the server upholds forward secrecy. So going forward, any leaks that take place that could happen, any accidents that the server could happen to the server, will not impact the past communications. So generally, until about 2014, when the Heartbleed security bug became quite famous in the world, and the world went on panic at the time, people knew about this sort of property, and they knew that it was important within the research community. However, at the industrial level, at the commercial level, it wasn't very well known until about 2014, when the Heartbleed security bug was discovered. So we will look a little bit later at what Heartbleed bug was, and what its relationship with this PFS property is. So this is more in diagrammatic terms. We have here a simple diagram sort of demonstrating what PFS is. So as you can see, we have several sessions. So these are sessions of the same protocol being run, for example, between Alice and Bob, or between the client and the server. And during each session, there is a session key which is generated for the duration of that single session. So K1, for example, is generated for use within session 1. K2 is generated for use within session 2, and so on. Kn is generated for use within session n. So that's all nice and perfect until we arrive to a point where the server or Bob or Alice or any of the agents participating in the protocol, any of the honest agents participating in the protocol, suddenly leak or essentially their long-term keys are compromised. Okay, so suppose you have an attacker who manages to break into the server and steal the long-term key or long-term password which any of these agents participating in the protocol are using throughout. Now, if that becomes the case, then the important question is this one: will the secrecy of the past session keys K1, K2, all the way until Kn, so all the way until the point at which the compromise took place, is still upheld? Okay, so do we still have those keys secret? If the answer is yes, then there's nothing to worry about. If the answer is no, that we now, by compromising the long-term key, also have compromised K1, K2, all the way to Kn, then indeed we must be quite worried, because that means that essentially we can go back at those past communications and we can decrypt them, decipher them, and essentially understand what sensitive data were being communicated. So here is an example exactly of where the PFS property does not hold. Okay, so we have a three-way handshake between Alice and Bob, and essentially Alice sends to Bob a key, session key that she's proposing for future communications within that specific session, and that key is encrypted with the public key for Bob. Now, when Bob receives this key, he is the only one in the world who has access to his private key, and therefore he will use that private key to decrypt this message or decipher it and release its content, which is K. So then Bob will have access to K. So once Bob has access to K, he sends a hello world message to Alice, some kind of sensitive message to Alice, and Alice then replies back with a different message to Bob. Okay, so that's a simple three-way handshake, which involves essentially agreeing or exchanging a session key K, which is then used for communicating a couple of sensitive or secret messages. Now, the question here, of course, is once we are done with this session, if there was an intruder that appeared from nowhere and managed to steal Bob's private key, so break into Bob's server and steal Bob's private key, will that have an impact on the messages, the sensitive messages that were essentially exchanged between Alice and Bob earlier on? So the answer to that is yes. There will be an impact because of the fact that if the intruder manages to steal Bob's private key, then the intruder also has access to, of course, the individual messages. Okay, so the intruder will have been listening, so the intruder knows that there is an encryption here that took place, an encrypted message that was communicated. It also knows of the second encrypted message and the third encrypted message. Now, if the intruder steals the private key for Bob, then the intruder will very simply decrypt the first message and release K from it. And then the intruder will use K to decrypt the second message and the third message, therefore releasing the content of those two last messages. So the answer is, if Bob ever had the local server compromised, and the private key stolen or leaked, then all the interactions that took place between Bob and Alice in this protocol will also be compromised. And therefore, the protocol as such, this three-way handshake, as such has no perfect forward secrecy, has no forward secrecy property. Okay. So, what is the solution to that? Okay, so we take first the first proposal for solving that is using Diffie-Hellman key agreement protocol, okay, or calculation, as we covered it in the last lecture. So remember, Diffie-Hellman, we said, was a very simple protocol. The idea was that Alice and Bob each has their own secret numbers, say small a for Alice and small b for Bob. Now, before that, both Alice and Bob will also have agreed on two predefined prime numbers, p, small p, and small g. Then essentially both parties will perform or will exchange two numbers. Okay, so Alice will send to Bob the following number, p raised to the power of her secret number small a modulus g, and Bob will send to Alice the following number, which is p raised to the power of the secret number small b modulus g. And once they exchange these two calculations or these two numbers, Bob will receive this number and from Alice, and he will raise it to the power of his own small secret number small b modulus g. And Alice, similarly, when she receives this number, she will raise it to the power of her own secret number small a, and again modulus or modulo g. Now, the magical trick about Diffie-Hellman is that the two sides of this computation are essentially an equivalence. Okay, so you end up with two numbers exactly the same, which is essentially the key that the two sides have agreed on using for future communications. Okay, so as you can see, they've exchanged two sub-numbers or sub-calculations, this one and this one. So these go in the public domain, but locally they managed to compute secret key that no one can compute by just looking at this number or this number. And the trick is that you have no access as an external observer. You have no access to your small or Bob's small b and Alice's small a secret numbers. So that was the idea of the Diffie-Hellman protocol as a quick recap. And this turns out to be a very handsome solution for solving the PFS problem in some protocols. Okay, so let's have a look and see again here. an example where this Diffie-Hellman calculation is used to maintain or to achieve a PFS property in a four-way handshake or a four-message protocol. So in this case, we have again Alice and Bob communicating with each other, and the protocol starts with Alice sending Bob her Diffie-Hellman computation, first computation or first calculation, encrypted with the long-term key that she shares with Bob. Okay, so this is like kind of a long-term password or long-term key that A and B share with each other. Now, Bob, upon receiving this message, can easily decrypt it and release the internal part here. Once he releases this internal part, he can go back and perform this side of the Diffie-Hellman calculation and therefore compute K. At the same time, Bob will send Alice his own subcalculation, okay, encrypted with the same key, the long-term password that he shares with Alice. So when Alice receives this encrypted message, she will then decrypt it because she knows KAB, and she will then release the internal content. Now, the internal content, of course, allows her to compute her side of the Diffie-Hellman calculation and therefore arrive at the same K that Bob had arrived at in the previous step. So that's all fine. They both agree on a key K, which we have basically just written down in an expanded form here. So Alice then uses this new key or this session key, this Diffie-Hellman session key, to encrypt a secret message, "Hello World," to Bob. Of course, Bob, when he receives this encryption, he can decrypt the message because he's equally calculated the same key and release this "Hello World" message. So when he does that, he then goes back and encrypts it with his own calculation, which is the same key K, and sends it back to Alice. When Alice receives it, she can use her key, this one that she calculated earlier, to decrypt the second or the message she received from Bob and release the same message, "Hello World." So she knows that Bob essentially has successfully managed to calculate the same Diffie-Hellman key, and therefore they can go on exchanging as many secret and sensitive messages as they want using that Diffie-Hellman key in the future. Now, the big question here is, what happens if the key KAB is leaked to some external intruder or some attacker, or leaked to the public domain? So will that compromise the secrecy of these messages that are being exchanged between Alice and Bob? The answer to that is no, they won't, and we understand why. Because if you were compromising KAB, then the only thing you can compromise in the whole protocol is the sub calculations. Okay, so the first sub calculation that Alice performed and the second sub calculation of the Diffie-Hellman key that Bob performed. Okay, however, we know from the Diffie-Hellman property that simply knowing this part, okay, this part only, and knowing this part only, is not sufficient for the attacker to calculate the whole key, because the attacker still needs to have access to small b and small a secret numbers. Okay. So as a result, even if we did compromise the long-term password, the historical interactions between Alice and Bob carried out according to this protocol will still be safe and secret. Okay. Now that's one way of doing it, but there are other ways. Another popular way is using public key cryptography, as we said in the introduction. And in this case, don't uh, we don't use Diffie-Hellman whatsoever. We rely on what we call temporary public key pairs, okay, or key pairs, public key pairs. And the idea here, as this protocol shows, is that you generate a public key which is temporary. So in this case, temporary means that you intend to use this public key for the purpose of this one single session of the protocol. So in other words, if you rerun the same protocol in the future in another session, you will generate a completely different public key, a completely different temporary public key. So temporary key pair, so that implies temporary public key and the corresponding temporary private key that you can use to unlock any encryptions with this public key. Okay, so in this protocol, Alice starts by sending, first of all, her name, and then she sends an encrypted message, and that message is the temporary public key that she has just generated locally, and she uses the long-term password that she has with Bob to encrypt or protect that temporary public key. Now, when Bob receives this message, he can decrypt it, no problem, because he's got access to KAB. He can then release this temporary public key and use it himself to encrypt a new session key called K prime AB, and then encrypt the whole thing again with the same key KAB that he currently shares with Alice, okay, and sends the whole thing to Alice. So this message here has got two encryptions, one inside the other. First of all, you've got the new session key K prime AB, which Bob is proposing, being encrypted with the temporary public key that Alice proposed in the previous message, and then the whole thing is again encrypted with the existing current session key, long-term key that Bob has shared with, or Bob has with Alice. So when Alice receives this second message, she can decrypt it, no problem, because she has access to KAB. She also has access to the temporary public key that she created earlier, so she can go on and decrypt the internal part as well, and therefore she can release the temporary, not the temporary, but the new session key that Bob is essentially proposing for use in the future. And or I should rather say the new long-term key that Bob is proposing to use in the future, because it's a new version. K prime AB is a new version of KAB. So essentially, that means it's a new password. It's a new long-term password that Bob is proposing to use with Alice. And then after that's done, they both go on and use that long-term password to exchange a couple of messages between them that they can both decrypt, because they both got access to this new long-term key that was generated in message 2. Now the question is, of course, in terms of the PFS property, is what happens. Okay, what happens if again I were going to compromise my old long time shared key, okay, or long time password. If that's compromised, will that impact or will that have any effect on the new long-term password k prime AB? The answer is no, it won't. And the reason is that if you did compromise KAB, then all what you can do is you can essentially you will essentially have compromised this encryption here. But the problem with this encryption here is that you have no way of decrypting this unless you have the temporary private key. Okay, so it's no use even if you knew the temporary public key from the first message. That's no use, because in order for you to decrypt this, you need to have the temporary private key corresponding to KPB temp. So therefore, compromising KAB has no impact on essentially compromising K prime AB. Now that comes with a condition attached to it, which is the assumption that if you as an intruder were able to break into Bob's system or Alice's system and compromise KAB, then the assumption is that you have not at the same time compromised the temporary key pair that was generated by Alice in the first message, okay, or before the first message. Well, because if you did, then you will have access, or you will have got access to the temporary private key, and therefore you will have also then the ability to decrypt this internal part. That's a fair assumption, because temporary keys by their very nature are not assumed to live for very long, and basically if if you've finished your session, then the assumption is immediately that you will dispose of that temporary key pair. So you will have some secure way of deleting the temporary key pair that you generated specifically for the purpose of communication for one session of this protocol. Okay, so that's the second way of that you could, in which you can use public key cryptography. So no Diffie-Hellman here, just public key cryptography in order to arrive at or in order to achieve a perfect forward secrecy property. Right, so we now move on to the kind of more practical side of this, or more pragmatic side of why PFS is such an important property in systems in general. And we take the example of the Heartbleed bug, which was announced back in 2014 as a sort of a prime example of why PFS is such an important property. Okay, so in order for us to understand what the Heartbleed bug was, we first need to understand what the Heartbeat protocol is. Okay, so the bug happens because as part of a protocol called the Heartbleed protocol. And the Heartbleed protocol is, or Heartbeat, sorry, I should say not the Heartbleed, but Heartbeat protocol is part of your standard SSL. Okay, so each time you do HTTPS, HTTPS is using SSL or TLS, as we call it. As part of that, you also have this small, tiny protocol called Heartbleed protocol, which takes place at the same time. Now, the idea of Heartbeat is essentially you would like to understand if the server is still alive. Okay, so that hence you're checking the heartbeat of the server. You want to understand that it's still alive, and the way you do it is via two messages. Okay, so it's a two-way handshake. The client will send a message hello, and the size of that message. Okay, so hello in this case has got 5 digits, and the server then will reply all with the same message hello back again to the client. Okay, so in this case the client knows that the server is still alive, so it's like a pinging kind of mechanism, if you like, a very simplistic pinging mechanism. However, it has this thing about it, is that you have to specify the size of your ping message, in this case hello. You have to specify the size of that message, and based on that size the server is going to take exact number of bits or digits and send it back to the client. Okay, so if you've told the server that your ping is size 5, then the server will take the first 5 digits and send them back to your client, and that will be hello again. Okay. However, this has got a nasty bug associated with it, because in 2014 the world understood that you can do something really nasty here, which is lie about the size of your pinging message. Okay, so instead of saying the actual size, in this case it was 5 digits or 5, you can lie about that, and you can specify any other number you want the server to reply with. And after that, at the same time, actually, they discovered that, in fact, most servers they were doing two very bad things. The first thing was that they were relying on this number to return the number of digits back to the user. Okay, so instead of, if you say hello 25, the server will return not just hello, but will return another 20 digits that it currently holds in its cache memory back to the client. Okay. And the second bad thing that they discovered is that in many cases, obviously servers for optimization purposes were keeping a lot of sensitive data, a lot of users' sensitive data in their caches, and therefore if you were asking for more information, you may not just get gibberish or random stuff, but you may actually get existing or some passwords that the server were using, or keys that the server was using in previous communications with its clients. And as a result, this meant that there was a possibility that good possibility actually, that if you did lie about the payload and you asked for not just 5 digits, but let's say 64K bytes, okay, that you could actually get a big amount of stuff, or even 1 mega or 1 giga, depends on the size of the cache. You could get actually a very good amount of sensitive data back released to your client tool. And that's why the world went into a panic, and everybody started checking the SSL servers and sort of to make sure that your server, first of all, did not fall for this lie, okay, so that it really did check the size of the ping itself, that it was just 5 digits and therefore it should just return 5 digits, but also that its cache was not or that the server was not designed such that it, as part of its optimized operation, that it would store any sensitive keys or passwords in its cache memory. Okay. But that was demonstrated to be the case, and that became essentially the Heartbleed bug. Okay. So as I said, if you leaked or if your server did hold any long-term keys, then that meant that those keys then, or passwords, that those keys or passwords were then leaked to the public domain, and therefore that meant, as we saw earlier, that you could take those passwords or keys and go back to past communications between clients and this server, and try your luck in maybe decrypting them and releasing sensitive information about transactions or communications that would have occurred between the server and the server's clients. Right, so that's like sort of that was sort of a small context into why PFS is such an important property. Now we move on to another flavor of the PFS property. Okay, so let's consider the following 6 message protocol. So here you have A and B again communicating. So A sends to B following message, her name A, coupled with an encrypted nonce that A has just created. So this is like a random number, random fresh number that Alice has just created, and that's encrypted with the key that Alice shares with Bob. So she sends this pair of data to Bob, and then when Bob receives this pair, he can decrypt it, release the nonce. Then he increments the nonce. Okay, so suppose this number was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then he can increment it to become 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, for example. Okay, and he pairs it with his own random fresh number, NB, and encrypts the two things together using the same key KAB that he shares with Alice. So when Alice receives this message, she can decrypt it, release the two nonces, the nonce created by Bob and her earlier nonce incremented by 1. So then she takes Bob's nonce and incremented by 1 herself and sends it back to Bob. Okay, there's an extra bracket here which is not needed. Encrypted with the same key KAB that she shares with Bob. So Bob receives this, decrypts it, releases the same nonce he had created earlier, but in this case it's incremented by 1, so he knows that Alice has managed to basically receive the previous message, and the same with message 2. Alice knows that Bob had received the first message. So that's all fine. Then we move on to the 4th message, and in this case Bob suggests a new long-term key called K prime AB. Okay, so this long-term key is presumably going to replace the existing old, or which will become old, long-term key KAB. Okay, and he creates a new nonce N prime B. Then he sends the two information encrypted with the two things encrypted with the existing long-term key he shares with Alice. Alice receives this message. She can decrypt it, and she can release the two things, including the new long-term key that Bob is proposing to use later on in future communications. Now they both go through a pair of messages that they essentially exchange encrypted using the new long-term key or long-term password called K prime AB. Now the question is, does this have a PFS property? But the PFS property we're looking for here is different from the previous one. Okay, so it's a different flavor of the PFS property. So essentially what we're looking for here is whether the new key K prime AB was let's say compromised, will that compromise future new keys that are proposed in future sessions? Okay, so let's have a look at that question from an attack point of view, in which we demonstrate that in fact that does not hold. Okay, so here is your current session, let's say session J or session number J, and you have a newer session called session J plus 1. Okay, now session J runs as normal, just as we've described the protocol here in a normal way. However, at the end of the session something happens, and that something that happens is that the key that the new key that you've just agreed, K prime AB, is compromised. Okay, so suppose once you've finished running this session, some hacker or intruder or some kind of vulnerability in your own server meant that the new key that you've agreed goes in the public domain. Okay, so the question is, will that impact the security of the next session? Okay, so in this case we're not looking at the past, we're looking at the future. Okay, so that's why it's a different flavor of the PFS property. So if we look at the next session, we see that everything goes as normal until we reach the fourth message. So in this fourth message, in something happens. Okay, so we haven't yet covered attack traces and the terminology that we use in attack traces, but for now let's just assume that this means essentially that the intruder C is pretending to be Alice. Okay, so in fact there is no Alice in this message, but instead there is an attacker, C Carol, for example, who is pretending to be Alice, and Alice for some reason is not able to receive this fourth message. Okay, so Carol intercepts this fourth message, which is part of the second session, J plus 1. And what Carol then does is that instead of actually allowing this legitimate message or encryption to be forwarded to its legitimate destination, which is A, Carol will replace this this message here with the older message, this one, which actually was created back in the previous session J. Okay, so what Carol has done here is that she's replaced the fourth message, which is part of the legitimate run of the second session J plus 1. She has replaced it with the older message that was created in the previous session. Okay, Now, you might sort of wonder, well, and so what? What happens next explains the effect of that, which is that both Alice and Bob, of course, will continue in the second session as normal afterwards, but they will be using the older or the existing key K prime AB as the new key. Okay, so the effect of this replacement of messages that took part here is that both Alice and Bob will end up using the same old key K prime AB instead of the newer session key or newer long-term key that has been proposed in the second session, which should have been K double prime AB. Okay. Now, if you notice that what we said earlier here is that that key was compromised, and so therefore both of these two communications, or these two messages encrypted with K prime AB, will also be compromised by the attacker. So the effect of this, or what this demonstrates, is that in a protocol like this one, where you are agreeing a new sort of longer term key using an existing older key, in fact, if you did compromise this new key at any stage, that will have a knock-on effect on future communications. Okay, so if I manage to compromise K prime AB, then I will have compromised the new session, and in fact every other session that occurs later on, because I can always do the following substitution of messages where I convince both Alice and Bob to use the compromised key K prime AB instead of a non-compromised new key K double prime AB. Now, it will have a knock-on effect on future communications, but obviously not on past communications. Okay, so anything that happened earlier, I cannot compromise it, or I cannot decrypt any earlier messages, simply because those earlier messages will not have been encrypted with the key K prime AB. It will have been encrypted by some older keys. So this is not strictly PFS, but it is somehow actually related to PFS property, except that it essentially does not look backward. So if you're compromising here some long-term password, you're not studying the effect on backward historical communications that may have involved the use of that password, but you're instead studying the effect from a forward or futuristic point of view. So will this compromise lead to compromises of future long-term keys that are created or proposed in future sessions? So as I said, here is the interesting question. So you look at both, if you're taking this new flavor of the PFS, you look both forward, okay, and we saw that forward-looking, yes, it does compromise newer session keys, but if you're looking backward or in terms of the historical sessions, then no, it does not compromise, because none of those were actually carried out using this compromised key. So in conclusion, PFS is an important security property that has become an essential requirement for many communicating systems nowadays, and particularly it became very important when the Heartbleed bug was discovered back in 2014. It has become an essential check that you carry out on your server, and particularly on your if your server is using SSL, and most web servers nowadays they use SSL. So you would like to understand if the implementation of SSL that you're using is actually is protected against this bug or not, and if it isn't, then you have to patch it to protect against it. But of course, as we saw here, it's not just interesting from a implementation point of view. In fact, this is also interesting from a theoretical point of view, because it does demonstrate a very interesting way at looking at how keys, or the compromise of keys, can affect the secrecy of communications in the past. And as we saw in the other flavor of the property, how it can also affect the secrecy of communications in the future. And we saw that there were two solutions for maintaining this PFS property. So these are two common solutions. One of them uses the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, and the other one, or key agreement, and the other one uses temporary public key cryptography. So that's all for today. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.